this, which is something we haven't tried to do before, so please forgive if there's any weird sounds coming from that little table there. We will be having monthly programs here the second Tuesday of each month, excepting December and August. So check our website for the upcoming Tuesday night presentations. We're also doing in-person walking tours again, starting here at 608. These are brand new versions of the traditional Barbary Coast Trail tours with a little bit of a different spin and focused on this area of very old town San Francisco. So all the in-person walking tours start from here, and then one explores the Barbary Coast, one explores Chinatown, and one is the financial district. So if you can make it to those, we have them scheduled through the end of the year. Also, you might have noticed on the windows, we have some self-guided mobile app walking tours. They're essentially the same tours as the in-person one, but you can scan the QR code with your phone and download it, and you can take it on your own, go at your own pace and learn about the areas that way. The other thing is, and this is a new thing that we haven't really announced yet, we now have a kiosk at Pier 45 on the wharf. And the purpose of the kiosk is really just to bring some history out to the wharf and offer history of the waterfront, guided walking tours, and we have a mobile app down there too for people who aren't comfortable going on an in-person walk. So we'll be starting those in late September, and it's really an effort to have some honest history down there at the wharf and make it easy for people to get that and to learn a little bit about the city. So before I leave here, I'll let John introduce Thom Jackson, our speaker. I want to say that somehow some panoramas went missing in action. We don't really know what happened, but it seems like maybe 25% of them were never delivered to people. So we sent a message to the membership. If you didn't get yours, let me know. We'll send them to you, or we've got a pile of them on the table. So feel free to take one if you like. Okay.
Okay. Well, good evening. My name is John Freeman, and I've been chairman of this program, Dallas Events Program and Events Committee, for probably 15 years. I've seen a lot. I've seen a number of changes. I can go back to when we were at Fireman's Fund, and then we were at JCC, and then we moved to the old Mint, and then we moved to the Milton Myers State building. None of those ever was great. This was going to take some work, but the potential really excites me. I can't do anything about those two columns, but I have a plan where we might come next time. I hope it's in place, but we will have a retracting screen that you won't notice until you push the button. It comes down because it's the only part of the room that probably will never get changed in terms of putting another exhibit in front of it, or a case, or whatever else. So the idea is that we will probably be sitting this way with kind of a triangle of space on that side. So it's just an idea, but I'm working on that concept that we're going to do that. The idea is we're going to use this space not solely for telling this location, but this location is the heart of the city. It was the beginning of the city. And so, you know, a block away, this was terra firma, sort of. The rest of that was all water. So we have people who know all about the sunken ships. We have people who know about other parts of this area that are going to be featured in some of our upcoming programs. Now, not all programs, and obviously we'll use whatever's available, but we're, as Lana said, we have 10 programs a year. We've moved this down to a 6:30 start, seeing how that works. But everything is going to be a work in progress because we don't know how that's going to play out. If those of you who came by public transportation, it's not hard, pretty simple. I parked for the first time in the garage, the Portsmouth Square garage, and the fee for that is $4 for the first hour, as it is every hour during the day, and $4 for the second hour, and then go to dinner, and you're still not going to pay more than $8 for your parking at Portsmouth Square. So that's an incentive if you're going to bring a car into this neighborhood. There's a lot of possibilities that we keep talking about. Oh, we could do this, we could do that. All this stuff is work in progress. We don't know how it's all going to play out. But this particular space will be where we're going to do public showings. Downstairs, there are more rooms. If you haven't been down, go down. One of the things I always found curious about how this building is arranged is that you come to the bottom of the stairs and you walk in this area here, and the first one is the women's bathroom. And then there's across from the side, there's a door. That's not the women's bathroom. It's on this side. You go to the second alcove, it's the men's bathroom. That's the only thing that I think that needs to be addressed as far as where's the bathroom? It's not on this floor, it is downstairs. So these kind of things I'm learning about this building as everybody else is learning about this building. Our offices are all upstairs. That atrium in the middle is in the middle of our offices. We have a deck out here. Yes, you have a breeze coming down Commercial Street, particularly most time, afternoon for sure, but it has so much potential, and it is historically the first mint. It's not called the mint at the time, it's called the sub-treasury, but we're going to have a speaker eventually coming up who is going to talk all about the minting process and the early coins that were minted here and all that kind of stuff. So not that every program is going to be related to this site, but there are going to be a number of programs that is going to, for me, I don't know a lot about this part of the city. I really don't. My interests have been in the western neighborhoods, the other post-quake areas and so forth and so on, but not this area. So I'm excited to see what we're going to come up with, and that's my job, my committee, or the committee that I chair, to come up with programs that are going to be intriguing to you and are going to be things to enjoy, and there is ways of working around that. If you choose to come early and say, I still want to have a meal, there's restaurants around here, and if you're parked in the garage, it's till midnight, it's going to be a flat $8. So I like that. That's going to be written up in the panorama, so people are clear on that. We're not moving again. We have this building as a kind of a, what do we call it? It's historic. The bank owns it, and they can't do anything else but use it for historic purposes.
Right, part of the deal was when Bank Canton bought it, they had to maintain the historic floor of the building and make it available to the public as a free museum. So that obligation hasn't passed.
No, that is played in, it's been a somewhat abused historic space for a long time, but we're definitely turning that around. Anyway, enough of that. I would like to have you tell us anything you liked or did not like about how this is going, in terms of, I like it except it was so hard to get here, or I liked it except this, that, or I didn't like your whatever. I didn't put out a form for us to do that, but if you can let us know in some way what was positive, what was negative, because as I say, this is a work in progress, and we're kind of feeling our way along how we're going to do programs in here. We've had a program of 120 people in this room before, pre-COVID, chairs were narrower together and so forth. But so there's a lot of potential that we can use here. All right, so from that, let me move forward to Thom Jackson. Our program tonight is going to be by Thom Jackson. Thom Jackson is one of our tour guides. He does a tour of the financial district. He does a tour about the ships and the sunken ships that are within a block of us here. And he's working on one that is going to be a better representation of Fisherman's Wharf than what you're going to see in the tour book. So he's been with us about 5 years. Is that about right, Thom? And he is formerly a worked in finance and marketing primarily. And so he's got a personality and he's got lots of stories to tell you. And I won't go any deeper than that because I want you to hear what Thom has to say. With that, Thom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. So as John said at the end of the talk tonight, when you give John your feedback, make sure you tell him you really enjoyed that presentation. Just saying. So, hi and welcome to the San Francisco Historical Society Museum. Tonight, you're going on a tour of the Gold Rush San Francisco. Now, we can't actually obviously walk down the street tonight, but we will stroll along via some narrative and stories, as well as some slides. It'll be about a 45 minute tour, and the length will probably depend on the questions you have. So I encourage you to ask questions during the presentation. And we'll find out about what really was along Montgomery Street back in the Gold Rush era, and where some of the sunken ships and hidden treasures are in the financial district. So first, we're going to start our tour here at 608 Commercial Street, where most of our tours start. We are outside of the historic first and oldest mint in San Francisco. It was authorized on this site in 1852 and actually started operation in 1854. It was replaced with a larger building in 1877 and became a sub-treasury, and continued in that way until, of course, what happened in 1906, earthquake and fire. And that reduced it to a one-story building. The downstairs vault area, which I think all of you have probably seen, was preserved and eventually was bought by the Bank of Canton. It's now a recognized state in California, San Francisco landmark. Now, the first quiz is going to be right now. I haven't given you the answer yet, but I think some of you might know it. Who was the person that was the first assayer of the mint? Does anybody know? He is also the pioneer, the modern godfather of the California wine industry.
I can never, it's Augustine, I think.
Augustine Oresti.
Right.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that was him.
That was him. So he was our first assayer, but more known for his work in the wine industry. So before we really delve into the gold rush and what made San Francisco an instant city, let's go back and look at who was here before. It wasn't the Spanish, it wasn't the Russians, it wasn't Mexico, it was the Ohlone people. And this is the earliest illustration we have of the Ohlone people. And this is from 1816. And they were actually paddling that boat, which is called a balsa, in San Francisco Bay. And this was a boat that could carry up to 4 people. It was very versatile and go inside the coast. And you'll notice here that these paddles also are spears. They're very good for sticking fish as you're going through the water. There's something in this slide that is really not supposed to be there as far as their culture, and that is the woven blanket, which is courtesy of the mission. So the Ohlones did work at the mission, and they really didn't fare well under either the Spanish or the Mexican government. They, as you can see, going from this to going to the mission, a different way of life, forced labor, no pay, hunger and disease caused a severe decline in the Ohlone population. So our first quiz, where is the first mint located? Yes.
Here.
Ah, all right, great. All right, that wasn't a trick question. All right, so we're talking about the Ohlone. This is a portrait of William Alexander Leidesdorff, who predated the gold rush. He got here in 1841, 1842. And when he arrived here, there were only a few Ohlone Indians at the mission. And by 1842, there were only 8 Indians left at the mission. So a pretty sad ending for a really good group of people. But who was Alexander Leidesdorff? He was born in St. Croix. His father was a Danish plantation owner. His mother was a West Indian woman. So Alexander was of mixed descent. He eventually made his way to New Orleans in 1840, and he was successful there, and he fell in love with a beautiful blonde Southern belle. However, her father forbade her to marry Alexander because of his mixed heritage. So they broke off the engagement, and Leidesdorff decided, I'm going to San Francisco and make my fortune. As he was leaving the port of New Orleans, he saw a funeral procession going down Canal Street, and it was his dearly beloved Southern belle who had died of a broken heart. Pretty sad. But Alexander came to San Francisco. This is what he looked like in those days. And he was a very prominent business person in San Francisco. He had the Leidesdorff Hide and Warehouse. He operated the first steamboat in San Francisco Bay for passengers and for cargo. He was part of the town council. He was the treasurer, and he was, in those days, a millionaire. Unfortunately, he died of what's called brain fever or encephalitis in 1848, just as gold was discovered. And so we know that he is buried today in San Francisco. There's his gravestone, his grave marker, and another question for you all. Where is it? Where is that grave marker?
Mission Dolores.
Mission Dolores, where? In the Mission. Well, there's a huge,
True.
huge cemetery. So Alexander Leidesdorff is one of the few people that was buried inside of the chapel. Maybe 5 people buried there. So it was the measure of this man and respect that he had in early San Francisco that he was buried there. Question? Yeah.
You said he did a ferry boat or a steam?
The first steam paddle ferry boat in San Francisco Bay.
Who was, I mean, you said it was cargo, but also actually who was?
There weren't many people here. in those days. So- and there wasn't much industry either. In fact, there was no industry. And one of the things that this area was known for in California was the production of hides from cows. And if you've ever read 2 Years Before the Mass, Richard Henry Dana, he's marked here in the back. That was one of the things that his ship was taking on board back in the 1820s was cowhides, dried cowhides, which they took back east to be tanned and turned into products, goods, and services. So we remember him today in a couple of different ways. This is I would say, a larger than life statue of him. Very purposeful, striding forward. And can anybody tell me where this statue is?
Pine and Leidesdorff.
Pine and Leidesdorff.
They don't want you here because of that. It's probably something you can't.
Well, that statue was originally supposed to be in the Merchants Exchange.
Yeah,
It's too heavy.
yeah.
So on one end of Leidesdorff, you have the statue. On the other end, on Sacramento and Leidesdorff, you have his plaque, which in picture form depicts just what we talked about. His early life, New Orleans, the whole thing. So you go through the whole cycle in the pictures. It's really kind of neat. So let's take a look at what San Francisco looked like back then, 1846, 1847.
Okay, stop you.
Yeah,
Leidesdorff very locally, he's married.
he did not. In fact, when he died, for such a smart business person, he didn't have a will and it was contested in California for quite a long time. Yeah, he was quite wealthy. And I guess, it'd be interesting to speculate what more he could have done if he'd been here during the gold rush. So this is not San Francisco, this is Yerba Buena. That's what it was called back then. And you probably all know it's based on a plant that grew in sand, really. But what you're going to notice here is that there are very few buildings, right? It's a pretty small little village. And lots and lots of sand. Lots and lots. So you can imagine what a miserable place this was to live back then. There's no trees. And you notice a lot of ships in the cove here. This one particularly is Portsmouth. So Portsmouth Square named after it. And this is the ship that John Montgomery used to sail up into San Francisco Bay and capture it for the United States. No piers. So these lighter ships, these rowboats, had to be used to offload passengers and cargo. So even then, back in those days, 1846, and after, San Francisco was part of a large maritime chain that went down the coast all the way to Central and South America, and then west to the Sandwich Islands and the Orient. But let's take a closer look at this slide. So here, I'm guessing that nobody knows what this is. No. You got it, John. I figured you would. That's Lone Mountain. A huge, huge sand dune. So this is the old Hudson Bay house, which by then was sold to somebody else. It would be, the museum would be right about here. This Clay Street's over here. You have over to the far right there, a lagoon, which would eventually become Jackson Street. Here is Leidesdorff's hide house. So this is actually now would be the corner of Leidesdorff in California. And this is his hotel. He also had a hotel. The population at this time was about 500 people. No one knows for sure, but there were not a lot of people here. You had a road here going to the Presidio, and then a road over here going to the Mission. Because calling it a road is probably a stretch, more like a path. So you see some of the modern day streets we have, because this was just after it was claimed by the United States. You have Clay and Kearney, misspelled Montgomery, which, is not recognizable, what we see outside today.
And we're number 2, that would be Portsmouth Square, is that what?
Yeah, so Portsmouth Square is
Right.
right here.
Okay.
So when Montgomery came into the bay in July of 1846, the Californios knew that it was probably going to happen. So they had already left the city and they had taken the flag down off of the flagpole. So really all Montgomery's men did was they rode into about here and they walked up the street to the plaza and they raised the American flag and they probably went to DOJ's tavern and had drinks. And that was what we call the Battle of San Francisco. So, pretty primitive, but today things have changed a lot. And we know, for instance, what stands here. So a pretty shocking transformation. Yeah. But as you can observe, obviously, that the waterfront is nowhere near Montgomery Street today. So what happened? What caused that to change? So we're going to talk a little bit about that because the gold rush came. We had gold in 1848, and the gold rush begins. And by 1855, there's about 300,000 people in California. By the end of December 1849, there were about 25,000 people in San Francisco. So we went from a population of 500 plus or so to 25,000. So when you have that many people freely migrating to a space like what we just saw, you're going to have some challenges. So about half the people who came here came around Panama, and it was about around the Cape here, and it was about a 16,000-mile trip. Took anywhere from 6 to 7 months. It was very arduous, and people came from the East Coast, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore. But it meant in those days, you really didn't know what you were going to face. You left your families, you left your friends, and you were gone for at least a year if you ever came back. The majority of people really never came back. They stayed here, and usually the ones that went back didn't succeed. So here's a bill of fare showing a packet ship called the Apollo, which we'll see the Apollo later on, that came out from Boston and took people around. So they offer round trip, but very few ships, once they got to San Francisco Bay in 1849, 1850, returned back east. They pretty much stayed where they were. So you were traveling on a boat like this for 6 or 7 months on open sea, high winds, storms, really bad food, bad water, and probably some of your shipmates have died, and of course they got thrown overboard. Then you arrive in San Francisco, and this is about what it looked like in 1851, but it didn't take long when people came here in 1849 for these types of buildings to appear, as well as a lot of tents. So one of the things facing the newly arrived gold seekers was a lack of supplies and building materials. So here is an ad from the General Harrison. We'll see this ship again later, which shows all the stores that they brought. Everything had to be brought here. There was no industry at all. 75,000 bricks, 200 barrels of extra cement, metallic paint, nails, carpenter's tools, boiled oil, brushes, 25 pounds of coal, 3 new and superior launches, well adapted to the river. So they knew the Sacramento River is here, and they were going to use that. As well as 10 two-story frame houses, 20 by 20. That is a lot of stuff to pack in the cargo of General Harrison. And even back then, there was a housing shortage, as you can see. We can certainly relate to the housing shortage because we have it with us today. We've had it for a long time. So men lived in tents or shacks. They got the tent sailed from this is basically sailcloth. They got off the ships, and they created a living space. Some even slept on beaches, which was okay in the summer. I mean, we know how good the summer is around here. But fall and winter came eventually in 1849, so they needed a place to live. So they turned to a source that seems pretty obvious to us, but it took them a little while to figure it out. Lots of ships in the bay. Estimates from 600 eventually to 700 ships were abandoned. So when the ship came in, like the Apollo, the passengers got off, and so did all the crew. There was no one left to sail the ships. The ships just were abandoned and sat there. So, you know, other people have posed this idea. In fact, in Oakland, a couple of years ago, they floated the idea of using cruise boats to house the homeless in Oakland. That didn't get very far. wasn't deemed a good idea, but people lived in boats. So here's a map. It's really a 20,000-foot look of what the shoreline looked like. This is where we would be today, right now, in the museum. And this is the wharf. It was called the Long Wharf, which is now Commercial Street. And these wharves were built starting in 1849 to alleviate the problem, which we saw earlier, which was it was very hard to unload goods and passengers off the boats. So the idea was that the boats were tied up on these piers or wharfs, and it really made the unloading of goods and passengers very, very easy. So now we're going to look at where some of these ships were, and we'll talk about how they got sunk. So again, we're here, and this would be the pyramid, okay? So the pyramid basically is in water. We have the Niantic, and then you have Joan Harrison and the Apollo, and then right here is the Athenian. So we'll talk about all those ships. So the Niantic was the first ship that was really grounded ashore on purpose. What they did is they tied the empty whale oil barrels to the hull for extra buoyancy, and at high tide, they took a running start in the bay and basically jammed the Niantic into the ground at Montgomery and Clay. And that's where it stood. And then they staked it with piers to keep it so it would float out again. The General Harrison followed as a storehouse, and then the Apollo, and then the Athenian. We're going to talk a little bit more about those ships after a while. So the Niantic, after carrying over 200 passengers from the East Coast, became a hotel, a storehouse, and these other ships were used for other purposes as well. And the Niantic was the furthest end of the 44 known buried ships in San Francisco Bay. All right, what is the name of the street near Montgomery and Clay that used to be a lagoon? This is a tough one. Jackson. Okay, so far, pretty easy questions. Okay, so the Niantic was a hotel, first a ship. So this is what she looked like in all her glory. It's not a big ship; it's a packet ship, so it's a very lightweight ship, and it was a long trip around the Cape to get here. And this is an illustration of what it looked like when it was a hotel. And you can see here the bow. And it's a pretty lively area. So again, keep in mind, this is just down here. Currently, where it's buried is Clay and Sanson. So we're a block or two from where we are. Pretty amazing to believe that happened back in those days. But Niantic was more than a hotel. Oops, we have another quiz. Who put that in there? All right, what were the ships that were abandoned in the cove reused for? Housing, storage, restaurants, hardware stores, supply, any kind of activity that would support the city and the miners you can think of was in those ships, including restaurants and bars, of course. And brothels, yes. Yes, this is a PG rated presentation, so trying to keep it that way. So the Niantic was also a storehouse, and this is a photo of a scale model in the San Francisco Maritime Museum. So this is the port side of the Niantic. This is the bow, that's the stern. So you can see what they did. They basically took the masts off, pretty much leveled it to the water line, and then built up. So we're still using those kind of techniques today. You know, people want to expand their houses, they don't have room to go out, they build up. Same thing here. As you can see, it was a very active wharf, and there's the front right there. And this is the starboard side. So you can see the wharfs and the piers were eventually built around all these ships. And the piers that we saw, Market Street, Commercial, Sacramento, Clay, all those are obviously today's streets. And then cross-connecting these piers were basically walkways, so that you didn't have to go all the way up to land to get across. You could just come across. And those crossways became streets that we know today: Sampson, Battery, Front, Drum, Davis.
You know, that building, the hotel on top of it, would they have filled in under, put material under it, so that we stay there?
They basically, they hemmed it in with redwood poles, basically drove it down and kept it, and then had it tied to the piers. And it didn't start out that way, but eventually all these ships pretty much got surrounded by piers and cross streets, which were, you know, planked areas. So this is the Apollo. We saw a picture of that earlier, and they did the same thing here with Apollo. They built this up. There's a stairway here, and the Apollo was actually attached to the Long Wharf, which is the commercial street wharf. And again, it was a store ship. So basically, think about your Ace Hardware store. This was kind of the Ace Hardware store of 1850 and 1851. And of course, what would we be without a prison ship? So the Apollo is on Sacramento and Battery, and right across the street would have been the Athenian. So, you know, San Francisco has always been a wide open city, and it was probably at its widest in 1849, 1850. So I think they had like a one-cell jail in Portsmouth Plaza. So they decided to get a ship. There were lots of ships out there, might as well turn one into a prison. So William Davis, who was on the town council, sold it to the city for $3,500. They imported by ship balls and chains for the prisoners. And during the day, the prisoners did public works basically on a chain gang. And then at night, they came back to the ship to spend the night, and it wasn't very pleasant. And I think by about 1851, the ship became way too crowded, and so they finally built a more proper jail on land. But as you can see, the ships were a very important part of San Francisco's history, not just to get people here, but really to make housing and storage and other things. Okay, what wharf was the Apollo attached to? The Long Wharf. The Long Wharf commercial. So the Long Wharf actually was the longest wharf, and it went past where the ferry building is today. So it went from one of the longest street in San Francisco to one of the shortest streets. So Commercial Street today is only about 5 or 6 blocks. Okay. So if you have guys living in tents, a lot of open flames, drinking, gambling, carousing, you're going to have fires. And San Francisco had a lot of fires. In fact, the city burned down almost totally about 6 times between 1849 and 1851. But the largest of these fires was the Great Fire in May of 1851. And it was horrific. So all those piers we saw, and all the land where the stores were, it was all mostly burned. It was totally decimated. And so were the ships. So that's how the ships basically got sunk. They were burned to their water lines. Here is a General Harrison, which was a store ship. And you can find the General Harrison at Clay and Battery. And you'll see around the building, there is an outline of the General Harrison ship. It's about a 126-foot ship. This was uncovered in 2001. I think people are pretty much familiar with the fact that San Francisco has a law requirement that if you are doing excavation in this area where there might be ships that if you find it, you got to stop work. So the contractors and the investment people are not too happy about that because here they spent quite a bit of time uncovering the General Harrison. And there's the bow right there, which is pretty much leading into Battery Street at the corner of Clay and Battery. And in the back is the stern, which you really can't see because the back part of the stern is buried under the building next to it. So that never got uncovered. And if you go down to Clay and Battery and look at the General Harrison, if you look down, you'll see embedded in the sidewalk nails from the General Harrison store ship. So when they uncovered the General Harrison, they also found barrels of nails, which we saw in the advertisement, and put those nails into the sidewalk. The other thing you'll see if you cross the street from the General Harrison is a sculpture representing the General Harrison ship, which not everybody sees because they don't look up. That happens. So now we have the excavation of the Niantic, which occurred in 1978. This photo is a little bit faded. That's the only one that I really know about, which shows the excavation of the Niantic. And the Niantic was at the corner of Clay and Sansom. You'll see a plaque there commemorating it, but this is actually the excavation that they did in 1978. And guess what they found? They found the hull of the Niantic. So this is the stern. This is the starboard side of the stern, the right side. And you can see here where the water line was and where the fire stopped. And the heat was so intense that the copper shielding was used to protect the boat in the sea waters buckled. And this is the port side, the left side of the Niantic. And you can see this at the San Francisco Maritime Museum, which is now open again for visitors, and admission is free. So a lot of things came together to kind of take care of the problem of abandoned ships in the bay. But now that they've had 6 fires, it's like, do we really want to do this again? So what civic leaders decided was that they needed to fill up the bay. And as you can see here, we've seen the slide, but basically this is all water, and this was all filled in. But what do you think it was filled in with? Anybody have a guess? Everything from A to Z, but there was one letter of the alphabet particularly that stood out. Does anybody know what that letter is? Sand, letter S for sand, A to Z, especially sand. So San Francisco is about 75% sand. We pretty much know that. There are some areas that are rock, but there is a lot of sand. And so they use sand, about 33 million cubic yards of sand. That is a lot of sand. So how much sand is that? Well, if you consider that a modern dump truck holds about 20 cubic yards of sand, that would amount to 1,250,000 dump truck loads of sand. We have a lot of sand. Market Street is totally sand dune, 7, 8 stories high. So it was like, okay, we got a problem, we gotta fill the bay. We got a problem with sand dunes, we can't get around the city, we can't navigate. Kill two birds with one stone, fill the bay with sand, and they did that pretty quickly within 5 or 10 years. It was pretty much filled up. Not quite to where the ferry building is, but eventually the
Where did they
Embarcadero
bring
became
the
the ferry.
sand from?
Hmm?
Where did they bring the sand from?
From all the hills, Market Street, all that area was coast. So Market Street was all sand dunes. It was all sand dunes. You couldn't, I mean, people, if they're trying to get somewhere, had to weave around sand dunes until they got rid of them
So it was like,
to this level. So it was fortuitous that, in a sense, San Francisco had so many fires. Eventually, they just threw in the towel and said, okay, let's fill in the bay, and we'll get rid of the sand at the same time. That's interesting. So they use some manual labor, but they also use something called a steam paddy, P-A-D-D-Y. And it was called the steam paddy because it took the place of Irish labor. In those days, paddy was a derogative term for Irish people and for Irish laborers. So the name of the device was a steam paddy, which was basically a steam shovel. And they had a lot of experience laying track and up in the mines and having mechanical devices pull those carts along. So they basically built tracks out to where the sand was. Steam paddy filled up the carts out to the bay, back and forth, back and forth. And very quickly they filled it in. It was pretty amazing. So they took care of the problem of the fires, if you will, burning down the piers and all the buildings. But the second thing they did, which was also important, was that they decided they needed a supplemental water system to help put out the fires. And that's what we call today the San Francisco Fire Department cisterns. You've probably seen these circles in the city, in intersections, and those are underground cisterns. And many of them have are identified by round brick circles. Not all, but many are round brick circles, and that's where the reservoir is. And there are about 180 cisterns in use today all over San Francisco. And here's what we're going to see at all the cisterns is this cover, cistern SFHS. You'll always see that cover in the intersection somewhere if you don't see a brick circle. No, it's totally separate. In fact, San Francisco has a separate firefighting water system that's separate from our drinking water. And this is like one of the last, reserves of these cisterns. And the way they access them is through fire hydrants. There's special fire hydrants just for these cisterns. Here we are inside a modern cistern. This is the Mission District, which would be a good place to, be inside if we were attacked, but it's full of water. That's a big one. So the original cisterns, which were built starting in 1850s, held about 15,000 to 50,000 gallons. It's pumped in directly into the cisterns, and the cisterns are self-contained. And they basically what they do every year, every cistern is tested by the fire department, and they come and they pump water out of the cistern into the hydrant, and they have a hose attached to the hydrant and pumps the water back in the cistern. We want to make sure that there's no leakage and that the cistern and the hydrant are working properly. So the original one's 15,000, 50,000 gallons. Modern cisterns can hold as much as 243,000 gallons, and I would ask if anyone could guess where the 243,000 gallon cistern is.
This is water from the bay. Where's the
No,
water?
it's fresh water. It's pumped in. So 200,000, where would we hide one of those? Well, a good place to look would be under City Hall. Because that's where it is. So when you think about 15,000, 20,000, 30, 50,000, that's a lot of water. So to try to put in perspective, the average swimming pool today has between 10,000 and 20,000 gallons. So the cistern that's down here on Washington and Montgomery is unusual because it's got a square brick lining on top, very unusual. And it has about 15,000 gallons, so about the size of an average swimming pool today. The one on Commercial Street is a little unusual. There's no bricks on it. It's commercial in Montgomery. There's no bricks, but there's two cistern covers. One is really, really old, and one is more recent. And then the one on California in Montgomery has no bricks. It's been paved over, but it has a cistern cover. So if you don't see the bricks, look around for the cover. And then here's a map which you can get and see where the cisterns are in the city. And here's where we are right here. So as you can see, this is where they all started in the 1850s. And they're still in use today. Those are brick cisterns. You saw the one in Mission District, which is, probably pre-stressed or laid in concrete. They do. So if you go online and look at, say, what color are the hydrants for the cisterns, they'll tell you they're green, but that's not always the case. Because the ones down here on Washington, Montgomery, Commercial Montgomery, California Montgomery are white. And they're a little slimmer than the other hydrants. So the other hydrants you'll see down here are blue tops, chubbier, bigger, and those connect up to the water tank on Jones Street. So you have two different hydrant systems going in the city, and they're fed by different tanks or different reservoirs throughout the city. And depending upon where you are in the city, you can see a black hydrant or a red hydrant. So here, down here, a blue hydrant. And then you have the cistern hydrants, which are white and kind of skin. So, San Francisco has built out its water sources for firefighting back to the early 1850s when they had so many fires. So even then they were thinking about it. And of course, we know what happened in 1906. And so even again, we had to reinvent our firefighting water system, which is multifaceted. You have different levels of water. You have the sea fighting fireboats. You have manifolds that can pump water in from the sea. So we have a lot of redundant city systems to protect our city from fire. But we can thank our early pioneer people for thinking about it originally. So after a long, arduous tour, we're back here at 608 Commercial. Woo. But before I let you go, I wanted to let you know about our mint. And this is something that Lana will not tell you. Because not everybody who worked here at the mint was on the up and up. Apparently there was some gold missing from the mint. Because in August of 1857, when police searched William Ben's, alias Karl Klops's room, they found gold coin blanks, gold working and smelting tools. Karl was arrested for stealing thousands of dollars of gold cuttings. The mint's enterprising chief coin cutter melted down stolen gold cuttings and sold the resulting bars back to our mint through Wells Fargo. So thank you for being here tonight. And if there's any questions, I'll be glad to take them. Thank you.
I remember when Levi's was putting in their headquarters, Battery or Washington. or Jackson.
Battery, yeah.
And they came across a ship at that point. Was that identified? You know, looking at the map and may have been up there.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different indications on that map. So, and the legend basically says, here are the ships that we know they're there because we dug them up. And, you know, we've seen that. And then here are the ships that we think that they're there, but we're not totally sure. So, depending upon what that legend says, so you can look at that map, get it online, and get it from the presentation. And we'll tell you now.
It's also one here on the back.
Yeah, and on the back wall, Richard Everett and National Geographic put together this wonderful, wonderful overlay of the waterfront. And in fact, that case over there details some of the findings from the ship canvas. And in fact, when they were doing the Muni underground Market Street, they uncovered a ship. So basically, every time you go from the Embarcadero through the Muni Tunnel, you're going through an old ship.
Rome.
The Rome.
They came to it.
Yeah.
So they kept the whole ship there, so.
You go right through a ship, which is kind of cool. It makes it worth the trip like this. So if you want to do an actual sunken ship tour, just happen to have one this Saturday at 11 o'clock. Meets here outside the Mint at 11 a.m. this Saturday. And there's also a Jackson Square Barbary Coast tour this Friday at 12 noon. And Carolyn Moniz, who will check you in. She is the tour guide, one of our best tour guides, who leads the Jackson Square tour. Yeah, good stuff.